Okay. Shoop! This is how it began. Fujimoto's first series. Well, it's more a volume of his first one-shots, but it really encapsulates a lot of Fujimoto's early career from, as the title suggests, 17 years old to 21 years old. And as my first entry in my Fujimoto series, let's talk about it. So this volume has 4 short stories which I'll be covering separately, but spoiler warnings, I don't give a shit. A couple clucking chickens were still kicking in the schoolyard. Yes, that is the full title. Is the first of the one-shots in this volume, and it is one of the best. The second best chicken story in Fujimoto's catalog. This story is really heartwarming and shows a lot of what Fujimoto had to offer later in his career. It's hard to imagine that Fujimoto wrote this at 17-year-old, given that it's so heartwarming, and it's a story about 2 humans trying to survive in a world ridden with aliens who want to eat them by disguising themselves as chicken. And it's really hilarious. I think one of my favorite scenes is the reveal of one of the aliens' love interests. It also is interesting how Fujimoto goes about proposing the moral dilemma of eating meat in a way that's not like overbearing or anything, but actually thought provoking. I'm not sure if this is really like a pro vegetarian message or anything, but it definitely does give some credence to some of the thoughts he has when consuming things and the moral dilemmas that we have about them, but reframed where we're the victims. I think the ending of the story is also really interesting because although it seemingly ends on a hopeful message of this girl escaping the aliens that are going to eat them, it has this exposition where it talks about how later, very shortly after, the humans were extinguished. And it kind of shows Fujimoto's hopeful but nihilistic tones that kind of coincide with each other that show up a lot in his later works. Also, just want to note, although this is very short, the twist in the story works really well. I enjoyed that a lot. Sasaki Stops a Bullet is my least favorite of the 4, and also sort of the most confusing. The whole plot revolves around a hostage situation where a teacher is trying to prevent her students from being shot by having sex with the guy who's holding them hostage, who also happens to be her ex-classmate. And so it's a really weird story. The way Fujimoto resolves this is by having one of the students step up to the terrorist and catching a bullet when he shoots it at him, talking about how no chances are too low, and going into how the teacher claimed she was God. And so he believed that he could do this. The story's ending is even weirder, with the kid who caught the bullet going to the moon because his dead father said his soul was going to be there. And for some reason, somehow, he's still talking to his teacher 20 years later on the moon, somehow. And he's talking about how she really was a god and that he never caught the bullet, but she kind of allowed him to. And so I guess her powers allowed him to, and it insinuates that she really is a god, which before is just kind of her trying to explain that small chance things could be true, and that's how he might be able to do impossible things. But now it's implying that she was saying that because she really was a god. What's even weirder is the last scene makes it look like the Earth and the Moon are colliding while he's talking to his teacher, and there's so many questions to this. How is he talking to his teacher on the moon? Is she really a god? And I guess the story is like the power of belief, which is the last thing that you see on the page. But this story is a fucking mess, and like the weird sex stuff with the terrorist just doesn't add up into anything. It's not worth having. And it's confusing. It doesn't really get across its message that well. And so I wouldn't say the story is bad, it's interesting, but you can still see that Fujimoto is definitely developing his talents in storytelling. So I'm not a huge fan of this one. Love is Blind, the third one-shot in this series, is my favorite, but also the one I have the least to say about. The plot is super simple. So there's a guy who's trying to confess his love to a girl, while increasingly big threats stop him from doing so. So first it's rain, and then it's a robbery, and then it's aliens, and no matter what comes down to tell him, like, the world's gonna get destroyed, he says, I don't have time for this. I'm trying to confess my love. At the end, he does, and it's super fucking cute, and you should read it. And yeah, at the end, it has this really funny bit where the alien tells his wife why he couldn't destroy the planet because, like, it was a bad time due to them getting in a relationship. And yeah, I just love this. It's really good. The fourth and final story, Shikaku, is about a vampire who wants to die and a psychopathic hitman who's determined to kill him. And so this story ends up being a romance between the assassin and the vampire. because the vampire is wanting to die due to his boredom, but this assassin is just so quirky and funny and like kind of an airhead and interesting that he wants to live for her. So in the end, she follows all his commands to a T, and he finds that so amusing that he grants her his vampire powers, and they live happily ever after. I don't have much to say about this. Like, the characters aren't that deep, the story isn't that deep. It's cute, and I don't regret reading it, but it doesn't blow me away. I would say this is my third favorite story of the four. Overall, I'd give 17 to 21 like a 7.5 out of 10. You can clearly see that Fujimoto was a prodigy even early on, but it is clear that he needs to develop a little more before he becomes the legend we know today. And so I really enjoyed this. I would recommend getting it for yourself and reading all the parts I left out. And thanks so much for watching, guys. Criminal Acts.